The harsh winter of 1878 had claimed many lives across the Wyoming Territory, but nothing could have prepared ranch hand Jake Morrison for what he'd find that bitter morning. Three small figures huddled against his barn, their lips blue with cold, their eyes hollow with starvation. Native children, barely alive, seeking shelter from a world that had shown them little mercy. Jake's simple act of kindness would set in motion events that would challenge everything he believed about loyalty, justice, and the true meaning of family. Chapter 1. The Desperate Dawn. The February wind cut through Jake Morrison's worn coat like a blade as he stepped from his modest cabin into the pre-dawn darkness of 1878. The Wyoming Territory had endured one of the harshest winters in memory, with temperatures plunging so low that even seasoned ranchers spoke in hushed tones about livestock found frozen solid in their pens. Jake pulled his hat down against the bitter gusts and made his way toward the barn, his breath forming crystalline clouds that dissipated instantly in the frigid air. At 28, Jake had learned to expect hardship. The small ranch he worked barely sustained him, but it offered something invaluable: solitude. After 3 years serving with the 5th Cavalry during the Indian Wars, he craved the silence that only the vast Wyoming wilderness could provide. The memories of those campaigns, the violence, the moral ambiguities, the faces of fallen comrades, had driven him to seek refuge in this isolated corner of the territory where the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away. As he approached the weather barn, something unusual caught his eye. Dark shapes huddled against the building's eastern wall, where the structure might offer minimal protection from the relentless wind. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip, a habit ingrained by years of frontier living where danger could materialize without warning. Moving closer, Jake's breath caught in his throat. Three small figures pressed against the barn's rough planks, their bodies wrapped in tattered blankets that provided scant protection against the killing cold. Children, native children, he realized, noting their distinctive features and the style of their meager clothing. The eldest couldn't have been more than 10 years old, while the youngest appeared barely old enough to walk. Their faces bore the unmistakable pallor of hypothermia, lips tinged blue, eyes dulled by exhaustion and starvation. They watched him approach with the wary alertness of wild creatures, ready to flee despite their obvious weakness. Jake could see their small bodies trembling uncontrollably, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't determine. In that moment, the political tensions that gripped the territory, the ongoing conflicts between settlers and tribal nations, the government's increasingly harsh policies toward native peoples, faded into irrelevance. Before him were 3 dying children who needed immediate help, regardless of their heritage or the potential consequences of aiding them. The rancher approached slowly, removing his heavy coat and extending it toward them. The children shrank back initially, their eyes wide with terror born of experiences that spoke to the brutal realities of frontier warfare. Yet hunger and cold had weakened their ability to flee, keeping them rooted to the spot like frightened animals caught between survival and fear. Jake wrapped his coat around the smallest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, then lifted her into his arms. Her body felt frighteningly light, as if she were made of twigs and shadows rather than flesh and bone. The older children followed reluctantly as he carried their sister toward the warmth of his cabin, their bare feet leaving small impressions in the snow that would soon be erased by the howling wind. Inside the modest dwelling, Jake quickly stoked the fire until flames danced hungrily in the stone hearth. He set the children near the warmth while he prepared what food he could find: dried beef, hardtack, and precious coffee that he rationed carefully through the long winter months. The children devoured the meager meal with desperate efficiency, their small hands shaking as they brought food to their mouths. As dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, Jake Morrison found himself the unlikely guardian of 3 Cheyenne children whose presence would soon alter the course of his carefully isolated existence in ways he could never have imagined. Chapter 2. Sanctuary and Secrets. For 3 days, Jake Morrison's humble cabin became an unexpected sanctuary for the children who had arrived at death's threshold. The eldest, a boy of perhaps 10 winters, possessed the guarded intelligence of someone forced to mature beyond his years. His younger brother, maybe 7, carried himself with the quiet dignity that frontier hardship instilled in the young. The little girl, barely 4, had begun to show glimpses of the spirited child she might have been under different circumstances. Jake observed their gradual transformation as proper nourishment and warmth worked their healing magic. The pallor faded from their faces, replaced by the healthy bronze complexion of their people. Their movements, initially sluggish with hypothermia and starvation, regained the natural grace of childhood. Yet even as their bodies recovered, their eyes retained the wariness of creatures who had witnessed too much violence in their brief lives. Through careful observation and simple gestures, Jake began to piece together fragments of their story. The children communicated primarily through their native Cheyenne tongue, but the older boy understood some English, a skill that proved both blessing and burden in a territory where such knowledge often meant survival or death. Jake noticed how the boy would translate softly for his siblings, his voice carrying the weight of premature responsibility. The signs told a grim tale. Burned scars on the girl's arms spoke of a village destroyed by fire. The boy's hollow-eyed expressions suggested they had witnessed the kind of violence that the ongoing conflicts between settlers and tribes made tragically common. Their clothing, though tattered, showed the intricate beadwork that marked them as children of some standing within their community. Not random refugees, but survivors of something specific and devastating. Jake's military experience had taught him to read the subtle indicators of trauma, and these children bore all the hallmarks of survivors from a cavalry raid. The timing aligned with reports he had heard in town about increased military activity in the region, operations designed to force resistant tribes onto government reservations through increasingly aggressive means. As he watched them sleep by his fire each night, Jake understood the profound risk he was taking. Harboring native children during this period of heightened tensions could be interpreted as everything from humanitarian kindness to active collaboration with hostile forces. The territorial authorities had grown increasingly suspicious of any whites who showed sympathy toward tribal peoples, viewing such compassion as potential treason against the expanding American frontier. Yet each morning, as he prepared their simple breakfast and watched hope gradually return to their young faces, Jake Morrison found himself caring less about the political implications and more about the fundamental human duty to protect the innocent. The children had chosen his isolated ranch as their refuge, and he would honor that trust regardless of the consequences that might follow. What he could not yet foresee was that those consequences would arrive with the rising sun, bringing revelations that would forever change his understanding of honor, loyalty, and the unexpected connections that bind seemingly disparate lives across the vast and unforgiving American frontier. Chapter 3: The Reckoning Arrives. The fourth dawn broke with an ominous stillness that set Jake Morrison's nerves on edge. Years of military service had taught him to recognize the peculiar quiet that preceded violence, and as he stepped onto his porch to survey the snow-covered landscape, every instinct screamed danger. The children remained inside the cabin, their acute hearing having detected what Jake's experienced ears now caught: the distant thunder of approaching horses moving with military precision across the frozen ground. From the northern ridge, they emerged like specters materializing from the morning mist. 24 Cheyenne warriors mounted on war ponies, their painted faces stark against the white backdrop of winter. They moved in perfect formation, a testament to tactical discipline that rivaled any cavalry unit Jake had served alongside. War paint adorned both riders and horses, the traditional symbols speaking of serious intent that transcended mere intimidation. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, then stopped. The warriors had positioned themselves in a perfect circle around his property, cutting off all escape routes with mathematical precision. More importantly, their weapons remained lowered, prepared but not immediately threatening. This was not a raid or an attack, but something far more complex and potentially dangerous. The leader rode a magnificent black stallion whose breath created clouds of vapor in the frigid air. The warrior himself possessed the bearing of absolute authority, his scarred face marking him as a veteran of countless battles. Eagle feathers adorned his war bonnet, each one representing acts of courage that had earned him standing among his people. When he raised his hand, the entire war party halted with synchronized precision that spoke to years of fighting together as a unified force. Jake stood motionless on his porch, calculating odds and options with the cold pragmatism that had kept him alive through 3 years of frontier warfare. 24 warriors against one man represented impossible odds, even for someone with his military experience. Yet something in their disciplined approach suggested this encounter might not end in bloodshed, at least not immediately. The children inside the cabin had grown silent, their young faces pressed against the window as they recognized warriors from their own tribe. Jake noticed the complex emotions playing across their features: hope, fear, confusion, and something that might have been recognition. The eldest boy's expression suggested he knew the lead warrior, though whether that knowledge boded well or ill remained unclear. For long minutes, the tableau held, Jake standing alone on his porch, surrounded by mounted warriors whose intentions remained deliberately ambiguous. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the wind whistling through the pine trees and the soft snorting of horses restless in the cold. Then the lead warrior urged his mount forward, stopping just beyond rifle range. When he finally spoke, his words carried across the frozen air with startling clarity. The language was English, accented but precise, and the message he delivered would shatter every assumption Jake Morrison had made about the children he had rescued and the simple act of mercy that had brought this confrontation to his doorstep. Shapta fia, buns folgetin va. The warrior's first words cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, carrying a name that Jake Morrison had not heard spoken aloud in over 5 years. The Cheyenne leader identified himself as War Eagle, brother to a fallen warrior named Running Wolf, a name that struck Jake's memory like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape. Running Wolf had been a young Cheyenne scout who had saved Jake's life during the brutal winter campaign of 1873, when a blizzard had separated him from his cavalry unit near the Powder River. The irony of the situation crashed over Jake with devastating clarity. 5 years earlier, he had been lost in a whiteout that claimed the lives of 6 soldiers from his regiment. Hypothermia had begun its deadly work when a lone Cheyenne warrior emerged from the storm like a guardian spirit. Running Wolf could have left the enemy soldier to die. Indeed, military protocol on both sides often demanded such ruthless pragmatism. Instead, he had shared his meager shelter and precious fire, keeping Jake alive through 3 nights of sub-zero temperatures. During those frozen hours, 2 enemies had become something approaching friends. Running Wolf spoke broken English learned from trading posts, while Jake knew enough Cheyenne word from his frontier service to establish basic communication. They shared dried meat and traded stories of families they hoped to see again. Running Wolf showed Jake a crude sketch of his wife and newborn children. 3 small faces drawn with charcoal on birch bark, representing everything the young warrior fought to protect. When the storm cleared, they had parted without violence. Running Wolf pointed Jake toward his regiment's last known position, while Jake deliberately delayed reporting the encounter, giving the Cheyenne warrior time to rejoin his own people. Both men understood that their brief alliance existed outside the brutal realities of frontier warfare, a moment of humanity amid the systematic dehumanization that characterized the Indian Wars. War Eagle's presence here, leading a war party to Jake's isolated ranch, suggested that Running Wolf had shared the story of their encounter before his death. The warrior's scarred face showed no emotion as he recounted his brother's final battle, a cavalry raid on their winter camp that had claimed Running Wolf's life along with dozens of other tribal members, including the young warrior's wife. The 3 children huddled in Jake's cabin were Running Wolf's orphaned offspring, the same faces Jake had seen sketched on birch bark 5 years earlier, now grown and traumatized by the violence that had consumed their family. Their flight to his ranch had not been random chance, but desperate instinct, seeking the white soldier their father had described as a man of honor who understood that mercy could exist even between enemies. War Eagle's warriors maintained their disciplined positions while their leader delivered this revelation with the formal gravity of someone honoring both the dead and the living. The debt Running Wolf had acknowledged by saving Jake's life was now being claimed in reverse, not through violence, but through the sacred obligation to protect the innocent children who represented the future of their decimated people. Chapter 5. A message that changes everything. War Eagle's revelation about the children's parentage was merely the foundation for a proposal so extraordinary that it defied every convention of frontier politics. The Cheyenne leader dismounted from his war horse with ceremonial deliberation, his weathered hands reaching into a beaded parfleche bag that hung at his side. From within, he withdrew an object that glinted in the morning sunlight, a silver cavalry officer's insignia, tarnished with age but unmistakably authentic. The insignia belonged to Colonel Marcus Whitman, War Eagle explained, the commanding officer who had led the devastating raid that claimed Running Wolf's life and destroyed their winter village. Whitman had fallen during that same battle, struck down by War Eagle's own war lance in the final moments of the conflict. The colonel's personal effects, including official correspondence, had revealed intelligence that transformed the Cheyenne leaders' understanding of the broader political landscape surrounding their people's struggle for survival. Hidden within Whitman's dispatches were orders that exposed a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. Corrupt officials had been deliberately provoking conflicts with peaceful tribes, then using the resulting violence to justify seizing valuable mineral-rich lands for private development. The raids on Cheyenne villages were not a military necessity, but a calculated genocide designed to clear native populations from territories where gold and silver deposits had been secretly discovered. More shocking still, the correspondence revealed that several Army officers had been secretly documenting these illegal orders, gathering evidence of the systematic crimes being committed against tribal peoples. Running Wolf's rescue of Jake Morrison had not been an isolated act of mercy between enemies, but part of a larger pattern of honor among soldiers who refused to participate in what they recognized as murder disguised as military duty. War Eagle's unbelievable message centered on a proposition that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. The surviving Cheyenne leaders had decided to entrust their most precious possession, the orphaned children of their fallen warriors, to the care of selected white families who had demonstrated honor and integrity. Jake Morrison's name appeared on a list compiled by sympathetic Army officers, men who had observed his conduct during the Indian Wars and deemed him worthy of this extraordinary trust. The children sleeping in Jake's cabin represented more than Running Wolf's orphaned offspring. They were part of a desperate strategy to preserve Cheyenne culture and bloodlines through the coming decades of forced assimilation and reservation confinement. By placing their young with honorable white families, the tribal leaders hoped to create bridges between worlds that would ensure their people's survival when traditional ways of life became impossible. War Eagle's warriors carried similar children to other carefully selected families across the territory, former soldiers, missionaries, and traders who had shown respect for native peoples during the darkest periods of conflict. The program required absolute secrecy, as discovery would mean death for both the children and their adoptive families under the harsh territorial laws governing relations with hostile tribes. The choice facing Jake Morrison transcended simple humanitarian kindness. War Eagle was offering him the chance to become part of a clandestine network dedicated to preserving an entire culture from extinction, a responsibility that would forever bind his fate to the Cheyenne people and their struggle for survival in an increasingly hostile world. Chapter 6. Honor Among Enemies. Jake Morrison stood on his porch for what felt like an eternity, the weight of War Eagle's proposition settling over him like the Wyoming winter itself. Behind him, 3 children waited in the warmth of his cabin, orphans whose very existence represented both the tragic cost of frontier warfare and the fragile hope for a different future. Before him, 24 Cheyenne warriors maintained their disciplined circle, their painted faces revealing nothing of the momentous decision that would reshape the destinies of everyone present. The former cavalry soldier understood the full magnitude of what he was being asked to accept. War Eagle's secret network represented treason by territorial law, sedition by military standards, and cultural rebellion by the social conventions of frontier society. Harboring these children would mark him as an enemy of the expanding American empire, a target for both official persecution and vigilante violence from settlers who viewed any cooperation with native peoples as betrayal of their own race. Yet, as Jake considered the alternatives, the moral arithmetic became starkly clear. Refusing War Eagle's offer would condemn the children to almost certain death, either from exposure during the harsh winter or from the systematic violence that had already claimed their parents. The territorial authorities showed no mercy toward native children found outside reservation boundaries, viewing them as future warriors to be eliminated rather than innocents to be protected. More profoundly, Jake recognized that War Eagle's proposition offered him something he had sought without realizing it, a chance to transform the guilt and trauma of his military service into something resembling redemption. The Indian Wars had forced him to participate in actions that violated his fundamental sense of human decency, creating wounds that isolation and solitude had failed to heal. Protecting Running Wolf's children would honor the debt he owed to the warrior who had saved his life, while simultaneously rejecting the dehumanizing logic that had made such wars possible. The decision crystallized with the sudden clarity that often accompanies truly significant choices. Jake Morrison stepped down from his porch and walked slowly toward War Eagle, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. The Cheyenne leader dismounted to meet him, and the two men stood face to face in the snow, former enemies united by their shared understanding of honor, sacrifice, and the sacred obligation to protect the innocent. When Jake extended his hand in acceptance, War Eagle grasped it with the firm grip of a warrior acknowledging an equal. The handshake sealed more than an agreement about the children's future. It forged an alliance between men who had chosen conscience over convention, mercy over vengeance, and hope over the bitter certainties of racial hatred. As the war party rode away across the frozen landscape, Jake Morrison turned back toward his cabin, where 3 Cheyenne children awaited their new life. He had found his purpose in the most unlikely of circumstances, becoming the guardian of a future that would honor both the Native American heritage they carried and the American frontier that had nearly destroyed them. If this incredible true story of courage and compassion moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold tale from the American frontier. These forgotten heroes deserve to have their stories remembered,